In 2015, countries adopted Sustainable Development Goals, and my presentation subtitle shouldn't exist. But the matter of fact is that we are halfway to 2030 and yet nowhere near to achieving these Sustainable Development Goals. And it means that we still need to figure out ways to protect the environment from our own industrial activities. And a big part of these activities is food production, and in particular, meat industry. So eating meat became so trivial that many people cannot consider something a proper meal if there is no animal involved in it. It's pretty amazing, as only a few decades ago, meat was a very luxury product. And nowadays, you can buy a hot dog at IKEA for only €1 or for £1 or less. Who doesn't like chicken nuggets, wings, juicy steak, bacon, or sausages? Everyone does. You can argue that the human population has grown, so has meat consumption. The meat consumption has indeed increased by 5 times since 1961, but meanwhile, the human population increased by only 2.5 times, and this overproduction is one of the reasons why we so easily trash more than 20% of all meat that we produce on Earth. So despite the industry growth, the paradox is that meat is one of the most inefficient ways actually to feed humans. Cows, for example, convert only 4% of the proteins that we feed to them into beef. And unfortunately, meat production in this way is like a black hole for resources. So while meat is so widely consumed and loved, it is also one of the most environmentally taxing foods. Why is that? We humans keep a lot of animals for food. Around 23 billion chickens, 1.5 billion cattle, and approximately 1 billion pigs and sheep. And this is many mouths to feed, so we had to transform Earth into a giant feeding ground. For example, to create 1 kilogram of steak, cow eats up to 25 kilograms of grain and uses 19,000 liters of water. According to projections, we could feed additional 3.5 billion people if we just eat the stuff we feed to animals. So the resource demand is so high that we use 26% of all land on Earth and 27% for livestock and 27% of all global freshwater consumption. And this enormous land use, of course, promotes deforestation and causes soil and water pollution with chemicals that have a potential to disrupt our hormonal balance and cause health problems. Besides that, the majority of antibiotics are used for livestock, and this overuse is creating antibiotic resistance and producing stronger and stronger disease-causing bacteria. So you might say, let's better eat organic meat, but we need to know that organic farming regulations are far from being ideal and are designed to grant animals a minimum of comfort. For example, according to EU regulations, an organic chicken still might share 1 square meter of space with 5 others. This is similar to the ratio that you see on the slide if you add one more hand to the ones sitting on the stick. So to satisfy our appetite for meat, we slaughter more than 80 billion animals each year. And the truth is, if animal suffering was a resource, we would create billions of tons of it per year. Last but not least, the meat industry contributes almost 15% to all global greenhouse gas emissions, and it is most famous for this environmental impact. Here on the graph that you see, it belongs to the sector of agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And this number will only increase in the future as meat production is not stopping to grow. There are a couple of reasons behind this number, and the major ones are feed production, and actually something that not all people expect. It is a natural fermentation that is happening in the cow's digestion system. So according to statistics, 84% of all greenhouse gases that are coming from the meat industry are inherent to the number of animals that we keep and kill for food. But we have to be honest also with ourselves. We like meat, and the schnitzel is amazing. It brings together families around our traditions. And it is only when we look at the meat production and meat industry in a global scale, our diet is eating up this planet. So what can we do about it? Should we close the farms and forget the taste of meat? It is not necessary if we transform project managers into advocates for sustainable practices and technologies. First, I want to cover what can we change in a small way from the bottom up, and we shouldn't underestimate the consumer power that we have and how our choices can change supply and transform the industry. As I mentioned, that we trash 20% of all meat that is produced, being mindful about not trashing the food that we already buy has the potential to create more than 20% difference. Taking a meat-free day per week also has a potential if everyone does it. And in addition, it can lower risk of certain heart diseases, and opting for ethical producers and meat alternatives also stimulates local economies. So an important fact to mention here is that implementing efficient technologies and practices in the existing plants could cut meat industry emissions by another 30%. So it is definitely one of the important areas for project managers to concentrate on and build projects around. But my question is, what can we do about it without giving up a stake? And nowadays, science and technology have the potential to provide us with real meat at a very low environmental cost. And this is exactly the topic that I want to concentrate on today. This idea has been expressed already for many decades, and I thought the PMI UK would like my citation. I would like to cite Winston Churchill, who said that we shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat a breast or a wing by growing this part separately under a suitable medium. So this citation is from 1931, and actually 82 years later, the first real beef patty that was grown in a lab environment was eaten. So it happened in 2013 when the founder of a Dutch company, Mozameat, cooked and tasted a first lab-grown hamburger in front of a crowd of journalists in London. And at that time, he ate 250,000 euros that it cost to produce a beef patty in 3 months. A brand, I put a Bentley there because a brand new Bentley has the same price, and the burger patty was not that huge as it is on the slide. Luckily, the things have moved on since then, and Mozameat currently claims that they can produce beef patty for around 9 euros. I want to explain a bit what a cultivated meat is, and in a very simplified way, the creation of cultivated meat is similar to brewing beer. The animal doesn't need to die, it only donates a small piece of tissue, can be 1 gram, and stem cells from this tissue grow in a reactor filled with a very rich nutrient mixture. So cultivated meat, it is animal meat, it is not plant-based, which is very important to stress. Of course, after the number of cells reach billions and trillions, this cell sludge has to be structured into either minced or steak meat, and this is a task for a couple of scientist teams. But this technology opens up very good opportunities to make meat healthier. For example, not to contain saturated fats or just vitamin content and nutritional value. And even though the process of creating cultivated meat is very complex, many companies have already proven that it is viable and it is possible. Currently, there are 156 companies that are officially registered under the cultivated meat category, and they're located in 26 countries. Some of them are very successful. For example, in 2020, one company started to sell their chicken bites in Singapore. And this year, 2 companies received FDA approvals to sell their products in the USA. So producing and eating cultivated meat doesn't seem anymore as a far future. It slowly becomes a reality. But the question here, I think, as many of you ask themselves, is really how much better the cultivated meat can be than a conventional meat in terms of its environmental impact. The world's first life cycle and techno-economic assessment showed that cultivated meat can be both environmentally beneficial and economically viable by the year of 2030. Of course, as this industry grows and scales up, we can expect more reductions of environmental impact. So let's take a closer look at the multiple sustainable development goals that I provide here and that I consider cultivated meat industry can target. So cultivated meat has a lower carbon footprint than beef and some other some other types of meats when a conventional energy is used. But of course, the vast majority of its climate impact comes from the electricity use. And the same way as electric cars are the most clean as the source of their are the same clean as the source of their electricity. Cultivated meat is most sustainably produced with renewable energy. And when renewable energy is used for cultivated meat production, it can reduce the carbon footprint of beef by 92% and pork by 44%. For chicken, it is comparable. It is actually plus 3% for now for the 2030 assessment. And considering that beef has the most impact from all meat types, it is a pretty good number. So producing cultivated meat using clean energy can, of course, reduce air pollution, and this reduction would influence our health. The interesting fact is that United Nations Environment Program stated, and I would like to cite it, that next pandemic will most likely be caused by animal farming, and antibiotic resistance is a growing threat, made worse by the use of antibiotics on farms. So, one of the benefits of cultivated meat is that it reduces both of these risks to zero. Of course, cultivated meat doesn't require as much land as conventional meat, and you can see the numbers that I provide on the slide. With this massive decrease in land use, there are additional opportunities, additional land that is released that can be used for carbon sequestration or for renewable energy production or even for protection of biodiversity. And not to forget here that there is no slaughter required. So we improve the ethical treatment of animals that we keep. So with no pesticides, insecticides, and herbicides that are used for feed production, cultivated meat will inevitably automatically decrease both soil and water pollution. Amazing is that with no animal husbandry and feed production and processing, cultivated meat has a potential to reduce water consumption by up to 90% or even more, depending on the projections. And of course, it is aiding in climate change mitigation. Cultivated meat is also way more efficient way for converting feed into meat, as before I mentioned that the cow converts only 4% of the proteins that we feed to it into beef. You can check the numbers that I provide on the slide for cultivated meat, for different kinds of cultivated meat. And in addition, I want to mention here that, of course, every cultivated meat production facility requires skilled work, and it has a potential to create up to 200 high-paying jobs, not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas if the facilities are located there. So without a doubt, it contributes to the three highlighted sustainable development goals. With all this being said, cultivated meat is reimagining urban development in terms of its quality. And one additional perk to mention is that it frees space for green urban planning. It is connected to the previous goal regarding the land use. So you have noticed that cultivated meat emerged from the convergence of three fields: biotechnology, environmental science, and culinary arts. But to truly flourish and glue these all sustainable development goals together, we need a synergy between innovation that is happening and collaboration, because it requires collective effort of policymakers and investors, in addition to researchers and even consumers, because it's the development of the cultivated meat industry largely depends on the consumer perception and funding. So this is where actually project managers can step in. Our role is to build these partnerships and drive this industry forward to transform the world. For this, we need to understand what problems the cultivated meat industry is facing right now. This would be simultaneously ideas to focus and to build initiatives and partnerships around. The first problem that I would like to highlight is that the idea of cultivated meat is mostly stuck in the specialized scientific community. So we lack awareness in society, and this hinders investments and creates a negative perception. So the first step for project managers is to educate themselves and to leverage data to raise this awareness and address concerns that people might have. And when we are educated, we understand the concept and we use the data that is published, we can address the concerns in terms of safety, for example, which is mostly prevailing. So the second step here, an idea, it's also helping the startups with market research and receiving feedback. This would help them with the development of technology and addressing issues that the public might be concerned about. So the second problem is connected to the first one. Farmers' communities perceive cultivated meat as a threat, which is not necessarily the case. This is more about inefficient and huge plants that have to be impacted, not small or local ethical producers. At the end of the day, cultivated meat is only one of the solutions, and it is not individual. All solutions combined can be kind of the food of the future. The third problem is that cultivated meat companies compete with each other, and this creates a problem of knowledge sharing and tremendously slows down the technology development. Basically, each company is developing the whole process and technology in parallel with others from zero. So the mission of project managers here can be to mobilize this scientific community and make it work towards a shared goal together than to compete with each other and not to talk about their technology and not to publish their data. The fourth problem is that the cultivated meat is still a very complex scientific challenge, especially when it comes to scaling up production. And the vast majority of companies struggle with investments to conduct the necessary research or to transfer their research from very small scale in the lab, which is done by people, to a bigger production facilities. So the idea here is to call for governments to shift some of their billions for agricultural research funds to cultivated meat or even other alternative protein solution. Another idea here is to develop public-private philanthropic partnerships or partnerships with investors. The last problem that I want to highlight lies in the regulations. not all countries are working on developing their own regulatory standards for cultivated meat. And even if they are, most startups struggle with funding and they cannot simply afford to navigate the regulatory framework for the production or for sale of cultivated meat in the countries where they are based. And project managers definitely need to facilitate the development of policy support for this industry, of course, with a focus on safety, and to find ways to help startups understand the regulations and complete the necessary work with testings that they need to submit before they submit the regulatory approval. So here I summed up some ideas for those who are interested and who would like to be involved to help this industry to move forward. You can check them after the session. You will receive the slides. If you could do one thing, I would recommend visiting the resource that I provide here. It is Good Food Institute, especially visiting their alternative protein pages. It contains all the resources. It explains the cultivated meat concept. It explains other alternative proteins, and it is a good start to get necessary information to educate yourself. And it also contains links to other websites and companies, and also to research pages if you want to dive into details. So now when we know what and why, which was the topic of the Sustainability Summit, and we have ideas on how, we need to start making small steps together to see a big change in the future. And I want to mention here that, as I mentioned at the beginning, that PMI Switzerland is launching sustainability initiatives and is inviting volunteers from other PMI chapters to collaborate with us. And you can use either the QR code or emails to contact us or to ask questions if you have any. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope our chapters can develop a stronger partnership. Thank you.
Maria, that was absolutely fascinating. I have to ask an obvious question, and that's, but what does it taste like?
So I was actually one of the tasters in my former company where I worked, and I was surprised how good it was. I would not expect. I didn't try chicken, but I tried beef. And if you know goulash meat,
Yeah,
it had a very, very similar. I don't think I would even distinguish it if I tried it with a blinded. So the taste was pretty good.
So how many times have you tasted it? In terms of consistency, that's what I'm asking. Is it always the same, or is it you just got a good batch?
So it depends. My company was still in the development phase. So when the work is the cultivated meat or steak has a texture, it has a smell, it has a taste, it has aftertaste. So the work has to be done on each of these parts. So sometimes when you concentrate to address one issue, the taste is changing, of course, because you're evaluating multiple options of texture, or you're evaluating multiple options of taste and so on. So it differs. But I think when you end up with the last version of a product, it will be pretty consistent.
Okay, I've got a list of questions here which people have passed me, and obviously
Sure.
written down. If people would like to ask questions, please do so. Question of motivation is, how did you choose to get involved with molecular genetics and biochemistry? Because I can't imagine, as a little girl, you said, I want to make pretend burgers.
Yes, so initially I did my studies in genetics, and I was interested more in medicinal biology.
Right.
Then, and the concept of cultivated meat didn't exist then when I was choosing what to study, but it was my passion that I followed. And as I mentioned, in 2013, the first companies started to emerge, and of course, the knowledge is spreading in the scientific community. And I thought it's something futuristic to be a part of.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see Christina Bruno's question there. She's asking a question about what she says is it would be great to have access to the parameters used to obtain the numbers presented on the slides, e.g. water
Sure.
saving. So you've done this in a very scientific way, so I'm sure you can respond to that.
Yes. So what I did under each slide, I leave a link to the source, and I will send the slides afterwards, and you can check different reports and data that I provide.
Christine, if you want to send a supplementary, then that we can drill into that if you want to drill into it. So the question is, does the traditional meat industry need to die for cultivated meat production and consumption to have the impacts that you aspire to or claim?
So I mentioned a bit already during the presentation as well that it is more, we are concerned more about these huge facilities where thousands and thousands of animals are kept in a very tight space, and their processes are inefficient and technologies are inefficient. As I said, that even implementing efficient technologies and practices can reduce the impact of normal meat industry by 30%. So it definitely doesn't need to die, and we also keep animals for eggs or for milk, and we would need them to donate the tissue samples for cultivated meat. In addition, these small ethical producers, I think, shouldn't be concerned, because also the technology is at the stage of development. It is not sold everywhere yet, and it is definitely not enough to feed the humanity now. Maybe in 10 or 20 years, it would be enough to feed the humanity, but I don't think in the nearest years it should be any concern.
So just to pick on that, and Pierre in the chat has made some comment about it's about consumers and what consumers want. So the question I've got written down is, what's the timescale and the market share needed for cultivated meat to be commercially viable? Now, I'm not actually sure that commercially viable is necessarily the right metric to use, but that's the one that's in the question.
Yes, of course, the biotech research costs a lot. That's why many startups struggle. And the time scale that was provided by the life cycle assessment official of the cultivated meat industry says it can be both environmentally beneficial and economically viable by 2030. But I also think it is a more optimistic projection. I would give it more time, 10, 15 years, I would think.
Do you think 15 years is a realistic time frame? What I'm thinking is I can't see what the sponsorship for the initiative actually is. I can see that it's being pushed, maybe the wrong word, it's being progressed by whatever industry it is, as a, what can we do to solve this problem? But 15 years isn't actually very long.
For in terms
what
of
I'm
the
sorry, what I'm getting to is we have ambitions for 2050, we have ambitions for 2030, we have whatever. Is there some sponsor as an ambition to say, right, we were going to have 50% of our meat is going to come from this source by a particular date, or there could be like a timeline? What's that's going to happen?
I think it is very difficult to estimate because it is still a very complex scientific challenge, especially it depends on the meat type that you want to produce. For example, I named some companies that are more successful than others, and all these companies produce chicken meat because chicken stem cells are easier to
Right.
grow to these numbers. But others, for example, like beef companies, they're less successful because the years that they need to develop the technology and find the solutions and so it's not possible like to say something definitely because when you do the research for research 15 years is not that long actually to develop something from zero, and when you do the research you run into new problems that you maybe didn't expect exist there at all. So I wouldn't give it less than that time.
So you've said you've actually tried one sort of the three meats that you've mentioned. In terms of market testing, sort of trying to create a pull, has there been much work done on that as far as you know?
So it depends on the company size because most of the startups, they struggle with investments and they have small teams and they concentrate. Most of the teams are made of scientists and they struggle to have additional money to put into the work that has to be done for public testing because there is a special regulatory framework. When you want to test a new food, you need to pass through all the testing that they require, and it can be that one test costs 20,000. And if you want to test multiple, like you prepare multiple variations of one product, the sum is adding up, and these are pretty big costs for the startups. And most of them are also in initial stages of technology, and to test it, to do a poll for a bigger cohort of people, of course, they need first to scale up and be able to produce more meat to test.
So in your presentation, you referenced a good number of the SDGs and had some very strong positive impacts against them. Do you feel that the policy environment is out of step with the potential impact of what you've talked about? I'm thinking if it's small startups that are having problems with something which is actually going to be significant in saving the planet, there's something wrong. I mean, there should be a much greater pull, or is it just they don't like the idea of eating pretend pork?
I think it's a combination of factors. To develop also regulations for a country or for a government, it takes a long time, and this idea of cultivated meat is fairly new. The first company was created 10 years ago, but majority of them are way newer. And as I mentioned, they develop their technologies in parallel with each other, so they don't use the knowledge which other company already had because they're competing with each other.
Yeah,
so
I can see that.
To develop these regulations, they need to know what the product is about and what needs to be tested and what strategies companies use to produce their products. And of course, because of the many scientific issues, investors don't consider it is a very good investment because they need to wait years before they start receiving some money from their investments. It is all a combination from different factors.
But where you've got something like that, I mean, there's clarity that there's going to be some really good benefits, but it's going to take some time and some investment. That's sort of like a market failure, whereby it's a good idea to have a government sponsor or sponsor of governments. And does that exist?
Some countries governments sponsor the cultivated meat research, especially Netherlands and Singapore, but it depends on the government. For example, in Italy, cultivated meat is, I think, banned. It was in the news recently. At the same time when the ChatGPT was banned there. So it is a different perception. That's why I mentioned so much about educating ourselves and also spreading this knowledge and spreading the knowledge to different parts of society, not only to the volunteers, but if there are projects to reach to people who are in the government and are policymakers or are involved into the process.
Okay, I've got a few short questions, and then we'll wrap. I'm really interested to know if just about everybody on the call will never have tried meat, and they're trying to this sort of meat. They'll be trying to form an opinion as to whether they're for it or against it, whether they like the idea or not, but they've never tried it. So is there a way whereby people can go out of their way and
so there is
get hold of some cultivated meat?
To try it in Singapore, actually, because in Singapore the sale of cultivated meat is allowed. And it was the first country to develop the regulations. So some companies started their research early in Singapore, so they had time to develop their technology, and there is no barriers for sale. And I actually think I even mentioned the restaurant under one slide where you can go and try it, but you need to travel to Singapore for now. Maybe soon in the US, as 2 companies received the FDA approvals this year. But I haven't read yet in the news that they are selling their products, or you can go and try them.
Maybe that would make a nice Valentine's gift or something like that for someone. But
for meat lovers.
Yeah, for you. Okay. I found that to be absolutely fascinating. I'm actually sort of surprised that for something which can have such potentially big impact against the UN SDGs, that there isn't more significant sponsorship.
It's more about return on investment. So investors want to receive profits way faster than to wait 15 years.
I sort of accept that. But for example, you've got nuclear fusion, and people have been talking about nuclear fusion for a long time, but it's always 30 years away. But money still goes that way. Whereas you've got something which has started relatively recently, and you've got a product that actually tastes like cow. And it's to do with, there'll be lots of technical problems, no doubt, but I think probably a lot of it's to do with scaling it in a way whereby you can demonstrate a market need. Market needs the right word, but
yes, a lot is connected to consumer perception. There is actually on the Good Food Institute, the link that I provide, there is also research how the idea of cultivated meat is perceived in each country, and actually Asian countries like Singapore is more open to the idea, because usually it is like 40-50% are absolutely don't want to try it or don't want to accept it. It is something I think that we observe in during our history, that some new revolutionary idea is always met with like fear, but eventually after it is around for many years, it becomes a new reality and it becomes usual for people.
What is it? The man who ate the first snail was a very brave man. It's something like that. Maria, thank you. Everybody, thank you for joining. Goodbye.
Thank you a lot for joining my session, and it was a pleasure. Goodbye.
Bye.